3 Evil Santa Claus Ghost Encounter Christmas Horror Stories. Welcome back to Horror Vault, your destination to watch for true and unique horror stories. Today, I am going to tell you 3 evil Santa Claus ghost encounter stories that have happened during Christmas winter season. Without further delay, let's start with our first story. Story number 1. The night Santa wasn't a Santa. They say adults can't see Santa Claus because they no longer believe in him. But I know that's not true. I wish I could say it was just a whimsical tale. But what happened that Christmas Eve so many years ago still sends shivers down my spine. Let me take you back to that night, the night my family and I saw something, or someone, that defied explanation. It was a bitterly cold Christmas Eve in the late 1980s. My parents and I were returning home from a festive gathering at a friend's house. It was well past midnight, and the streets were eerily quiet, blanketed by the soft glow of snow under the streetlights. We walked together, laughing about the evening's anecdotes, our breath visible in the frosty air. The warmth of the party lingered in our spirits, but as we approached our home, that warmth would soon be replaced by something far more unsettling. We stepped into our yard, chatting as usual, when suddenly the world around us changed. A brilliant flash of light illuminated everything. The ground, the trees, even the shadows seemed to dance wildly for a split second. The light was blinding, almost unnatural. At the same time, an otherworldly metallic noise pierced through the stillness of the night. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, sharp yet resonant, like machinery grinding against itself, but with an almost melodic undertone. Instinctively, we all looked up toward the source of this strange phenomenon. What we saw, or thought we saw, still haunts me to this day. Standing on the roof of our house was a figure. The light was too intense to make out details clearly, but there was no mistaking its silhouette. A tall form with broad shoulders and what appeared to be a sack slung over one shoulder. For a fleeting moment, it looked like he turned his head to glance down at us. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. The figure disappeared with it, leaving behind only darkness and an eerie silence that seemed to swallow even our breaths. The air felt heavier somehow, as though reality itself had been disrupted for those few seconds. I turned to my parents, hoping they might offer some rational explanation for what we had just witnessed. But their faces mirrored my own disbelief. Their eyes were wide with shock, their mouths slightly agape, as if words had abandoned them entirely. The rest of that night passed in a haze of unease. None of us spoke much after entering the house. It was as though we silently agreed not to dwell on what had happened, or perhaps we were too afraid to confront it. Sleep didn't come easily for any of us. In the days that followed, things got stranger still. All 3 of us began experiencing intense headaches and bouts of nausea. My mother dismissed it as a seasonal bug at first, but when it persisted, we went to see a doctor. He ran some tests but found nothing physically wrong with us. Just rest, he said with a reassuring smile that did little to ease our growing anxiety. Of course, we didn't tell him about what we'd seen that night. Who would believe us? Even now, I struggled to make sense of it myself. As time passed, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such an experience. We never spoke about that night again. It became an unspoken agreement between us to let it fade into memory. But every Christmas Eve since then, I find myself glancing up at the roof before going inside for the night. I've told this story to my kids over the years, not as a horror story, but as a peculiar family anecdote about the time we saw Santa Claus. They laugh and roll their eyes at me, chalking it up to an overactive imagination or one too many holiday drinks. But deep down, I know what I saw wasn't some jolly old man delivering presents or even a figment of my imagination. That figure on our roof, whatever it was something far beyond human understanding. And every year when Christmas Eve rolls around again, I can't help but wonder, was it really Santa Claus? Or was it something else entirely? Something watching us from above? Something waiting? Story number 2, Santa's Stare, A Nightmare Before Dawn. It was a cold December night, the kind where the air feels sharp and every sound seems amplified. I was just a child then, no older than 6, and like every other kid my age, I believed in Santa Claus. The idea of a jolly man in red sneaking into our home to leave gifts filled me with excitement and wonder. But that night, something happened that would forever stain those innocent beliefs with a lingering dread. I remember waking up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me from sleep. The house was silent except for the faint creaks of the wooden floorboards expanding in the cold. Then I heard it, a low, grating sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My breath hitched. It wasn't a sound I recognized, and it certainly wasn't one I expected to hear at that hour. Curiosity mixed with fear as I slipped out of bed. The hallway was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the Christmas tree in the living room. Its twinkling lights cast eerie shadows that danced on the walls as I tiptoed closer. My small feet barely made a sound on the carpeted floor, but my heart felt loud enough to give me away. When I reached the living room doorway, I froze. There he was, a man in red, standing by our Christmas tree. His back was to me, his broad shoulders hunched as if he were inspecting something among the presents. For a fleeting moment, my heart soared. Asterisk Santa Claus. He's real. Asterisk, but that joy was short-lived. The man turned around slowly, almost as if he had sensed my presence before I even made a sound. His face, oh God, his face, was not what I had imagined Santa's to be. His eyes were deep and hollow, like twin voids that seemed to pull all warmth from the room. They locked onto mine, and for a moment, I couldn't move or breathe. There was no kindness in his gaze, no twinkle of joy or mischief. Instead, there was something dark and furious. His lips curled into what might have been a smile, but it felt more like a grimace, a thin line that revealed teeth too sharp for any human mouth. My legs trembled as he took a step toward me, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. The air grew colder with each step he took. I wanted to scream or run, or do anything to break free from his gaze, but it felt as though his eyes had trapped me in place. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, more primal. It felt like he could see through me, past my skin and bones and into my very soul. A wave of nausea rolled over me as an overwhelming sense of wrongness filled the room. Finally, instinct kicked in. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, and I bolted down the hallway toward my parents' room. Behind me, I heard nothing. No footsteps chasing after me. But that silence was even more terrifying than any sound could have been. I threw myself onto my parents' bed, shaking them awake with frantic whispers about Santa in the living room. My father groggily got up to check, while my mother held me close, trying to calm my trembling body. When he returned moments later, he looked confused. "There's no one there," he said simply. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and refused to leave their bed until morning came. The next day, everything seemed normal again. The presents were under the tree just as they should have been, and there were no signs of an intruder or anything out of place. For years after that night, I convinced myself it had been a nightmare, a vivid dream conjured by an overactive imagination fueled by Christmas excitement. But as I grew older and replayed that memory in my mind, certain details refused to fade. The weight of his stare, the unnatural sharpness of his teeth, and most hauntingly, how real it all felt. I once asked my parents if we'd ever had a break-in or any strange occurrences during my childhood. They assured me we hadn't. Our neighborhood was quiet and safe back then. That should have comforted me. But instead it left me with more questions than answers. Now, as an adult looking back on that night, I still don't know what to believe. Was it truly just a nightmare? A figment of a child's imagination? Or did something or someone visit our home that Christmas Eve? All I know is that whenever December rolls around and Christmas lights begin to twinkle once more, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine. Because sometimes late at night when everything is quiet and still, I swear I can hear it again, that faint sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. And every time it does, I'm reminded of those hollow eyes staring straight into mine, and beyond into something far darker than I dare to comprehend. Story number 3, The Ghost in Red. I don't believe in fairy tales anymore, but there was a time when I did, when magic felt real, and Christmas was a season of wonder. Growing up, my family had a tradition. Every Christmas Eve, we'd visit my grandmother's house in the countryside. It was an old, creaky place, with wooden floors that groaned under the weight of time. The kind of house that whispered secrets when the wind blew just right. My father always had to work the day after Christmas, so our visits were short. We'd open presents in the morning, take a few pictures, and then drive back to the city. But it was the nights that stayed with me. The long, cold nights in that house where I would lie awake, waiting for Santa. I was a curious child, perhaps too curious for my own good. Every Christmas Eve, while everyone else slept soundly, I stayed awake. I wanted to catch Santa in the act. And every year I heard him, or at least I thought I did. Footsteps echoed from the floor above us, slow and deliberate. The wood creaked under his boots, and my heart raced with anticipation. I imagined him placing presents under the tree with care, his red suit glowing softly in the dim light. But there was always something that stopped me from going upstairs to see him. A warning from my parents echoed in my mind. If you see blood on Christmas Eve, Santa won't leave you any presents. It was a strange thing to tell a child, but it worked. I stayed in bed, clutching my blanket tightly. Years passed, and as I grew older, I stopped believing in Santa. Yet those footsteps never stopped. Even as a teenager, when I knew better than to believe in magical men who delivered gifts through chimneys, I still heard them every Christmas Eve, always above our room, always slow and deliberate. One year, curiosity got the better of me. It was late, well past midnight, and the house was silent except for those familiar footsteps upstairs. My heart pounded as I slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the staircase. The air felt colder as I ascended each step, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The door to the upstairs room stood at the end of the hallway. It was always closed, always locked, and no one ever went inside. My grandmother said it was just storage now, but something about it felt off. That night, though, the door wasn't locked. The knob turned easily under my hand. I pushed it open slowly. What I saw froze me in place. There he was, a man with a long white beard and an old-fashioned red outfit that looked more like pajamas than Santa's suit. He was overweight but not jolly. His shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. His eyes met mine, heavy eyes filled with sorrow, and for a moment, neither of us moved. I wanted to say something, to apologize for intruding, but my throat closed up. He didn't speak either. He just stared at me with an expression that made my chest tighten. Then he turned away and disappeared into the shadows of the room. I slammed the door shut and ran back downstairs as fast as I could. My heart didn't stop racing until I was back under my blanket, trembling but strangely satisfied. For years after that night, I told myself I had seen Santa Claus. Not the cheerful version from stories, but a tired old man burdened by centuries of work. It wasn't until much later that I learned the truth. One Christmas years later, during a quiet moment with my grandmother, I brought up those footsteps and described the man I had seen that night. Her face paled as she listened, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for an old photo album. She flipped through its yellowed pages until she found what she was looking for. A black and white photograph of a man with a long white beard, wearing clothes eerily similar to what I had seen that night. "That's him," I said softly. "Who is he?" Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she whispered, "That's my father." A chill ran down my spine. "He died in this house," she continued after a pause. "In that very room." She hesitated before telling me more, details she had never shared before. Her father had been murdered on Christmas Eve many years ago by an intruder who broke into their home to steal valuables. He had fought back but paid for it with his life. His throat was slit in that upstairs room where he slept alone. She found him the next morning lying in a pool of blood. The red clothes he wore, they weren't red at all. They were soaked through with his blood. I felt cold all over as her words sank in. The footsteps, they weren't Santa's after all. They belonged to him, my great-grandfather, repeating his final moments year after year on Christmas Eve. That night changed everything for me. Every Christmas since then has been tinged with unease. A reminder that some spirits linger long after their time has passed. And while I no longer believe in fairy tales or cheerful Santas sliding down chimneys, one thing is certain. I believe in ghosts. And every Christmas Eve when the house falls silent and those familiar footsteps echo above me once more, I stay in bed because some doors should never be opened twice. If you like listening to my stories, then I recommend you to subscribe to Horror Vault channel to watch our upcoming horror stories that will be more thrilling and mind-bending stories. See you in my next video. Good night.